lies a mysterious sealed sarcophagus. No one has seen inside for over 2,000 years.
For 200 years, visitors have walked all over Saqqara, past the oldest pyramid on the planet, without a second glance at the huge sand-covered rectangle beside it. It's called Gisr el-Mudir, and it may be older than the pyramid itself. Nobody knows what it was built for. What nobody knew, until January 2023, was that a cemetery of sealed Old Kingdom tombs was hiding in its shadow. One of them held a coffin locked shut for 4,300 years, with a gold-wrapped man inside that Egypt's most famous archaeologist called the oldest of his kind ever found. Saqqara, Egypt, January 2023. A team of Egyptian archaeologists had been working a patch of desert that most people never even look at. It sits about 15 miles south of Cairo, in the burial ground of the ancient city of Memphis, the first capital of a united Egypt. This is the place where the Step Pyramid of Gisr stands, the oldest large stone building on Earth, put up around 4,700 years ago. Millions of tourists come to stand in front of it every year. They photograph it, they film it, they turn it into the background of 1,000 vacation pictures. Almost none of them turn around to look at the field behind it. That field is where our story happens. And to understand why a single sealed coffin down there matters so much, we have to start with the strangest thing at Saqqara. Not the pyramid everyone photographs, the giant we walk right past. A few hundred meters west of the Step Pyramid, there's a rectangle in the sand. From the ground, it barely reads as anything, just low ridges, shallow dips, and a scatter of rough stone. From the air, it snaps into focus. It's an enormous walled enclosure, about 650 meters long and 350 meters wide. That's larger than the entire Step Pyramid complex sitting right next to it. The walls at the base are roughly 15 meters thick enough that you could drive trucks along the top of them, side by side. Its name is Gisr el-Mudir. In Arabic, it means something close to the enclosure of the boss. And here's the part that stops archaeologists cold. It may be older than the Step Pyramid. Older than the first true pyramid anyone ever built. Pottery pulled from inside the rubble of the walls dates the structure to Egypt's second dynasty. That would place it before Gisr, before the age of pyramids had even begun, which means the ancient Egyptians were already quarrying, moving, and stacking cut stone on a massive scale before anyone had the idea to pile it into a pyramid at all. The builders left behind 15 rough courses of limestone blocks, packed with a fill of loose rubble, with the strongest stonework saved for the corners. So what was it for? Nobody can say for certain, and that uncertainty is not for lack of trying. A British surveyor named John Shea Purring mapped the outline as far back as 1837. In 1990, a team from the National Museum of Scotland went over the whole area with modern survey gear, reading the ground with instruments that can sense what's buried without digging. They produced careful maps of the enclosure, and almost 2 centuries after Purring first sketched it, we still cannot tell you its purpose. Here is what makes it such a puzzle. There is no tomb inside, no chamber, no pyramid, no building of any kind within those enormous walls. That single fact rules out the easy answer. For a while, people assumed it must be an unfinished pyramid, abandoned before it rose. But an unfinished pyramid leaves a core, a footprint, something. This has nothing. Just walls around an empty space. So the theories multiply. Some researchers think it was a giant ceremonial enclosure, a stage for royal rituals we no longer understand. Others think it may have worked as a kind of dam, a barrier that held back sand and flash flood water while the Step Pyramid was being built next door. Its shape even echoes the old mud brick funeral enclosures down at Abydos, the ones tied to the last kings before Gisr. Think about that for a second. One of the oldest stone structures in the entire country, sitting out in the open, right beside the most famous ruin in Egypt, and we do not know why it exists. That's the shadow our sealed coffin was hiding in. The dig was led by Zahi Hawass, probably the most famous archaeologist alive, and one of the most argued about people in the field. He served as Egypt's Minister of Antiquities. He has been the face of Egyptian discovery on television for decades, and he has spent much of his life pulling finds out of exactly this ground. When his team started cutting into the earth around Gisr el-Mudir, they realized they had walked into a cemetery. Tomb after tomb, from the 5th and 6th dynasties of the Old Kingdom, roughly 4,300 years ago. This was the age just after the Great Pyramids of Giza, when Egypt's priests, judges, and palace officials were being buried in the shadow of the kings they had served. A whole layer of the ancient middle and upper class, tucked into the sand around a monument even they would have thought of as ancient. Most of those tombs told the usual, sad story. Old Kingdom burials at Saqqara were robbed in ancient times, sometimes within a few generations of the funeral itself. Thieves knew where the wealth was buried, and they went after it. Grave robbing in ancient Egypt was almost an industry, passed down and organized, and the richer the burial, the bigger the target painted on it. A gold-wrapped body was exactly the kind of prize that never survived. By the time modern archaeologists reach these tombs, the coffins are usually open, the bodies gone or smashed, and the gold stripped away thousands of years ago. Finding a sealed one is rare. Finding a sealed one with the gold still on the body is the kind of luck that comes along once in a career, if ever. But here's the detail that everyone missed at first. One shaft went straight down for 15 meters. That's about the height of a 5-story building, cut as a narrow stone chimney down into the bedrock. At the very bottom sat a single limestone sarcophagus, a heavy rectangular box carved from solid rock. According to CBS News, which spoke with an archaeologist on the team, that box weighed something in the range of 45 tons. And unlike almost every other Old Kingdom burial ever found at Saqqara, this one was still closed. The lid had never been moved. The mortar that ancient workers had smeared around the seam was still there, hard and unbroken, exactly as they had left it 4,300 years earlier. No robber had ever reached it. No archaeologist had ever cracked it. Whatever was inside had been sitting in the dark, sealed, since before the fall of the pyramid's golden age, before Moses, before Rome, before almost every date most of us can even name. To put that in plainer terms, they had found a door that no living human being had opened since the time of the pyramids. Everything you have ever read about ancient Egypt was written by people who never saw what was behind it. It helps to remember what the world above that shaft looked like when it was sealed. The Great Pyramids at Giza were already old. The kings who built them were gone. Egypt was being run by a huge machine of priests, scribes, judges, and inspectors, the men who actually kept the temples running and the grain counted. Hekashepes was one of them, part of that class that served the throne without ever sitting on it. When he died, his people lowered him down that chimney of stone, set the lid, sealed the mortar, and climbed back up into the sun. Then they walked away and left him. And nobody came back down for 4,300 years. Getting it open was not quick, and it was not easy. The team had to break through that ancient mortar by hand, slowly and carefully, without cracking the box or crushing whatever lay inside. 15 meters underground, in a cramped stone shaft, with a 5-story climb back to daylight, they worked at the seal. Picture the air down there, still and stale, thick with dust that had not moved in 40 centuries. Picture the sound of tools scraping at a plug of mortar that a workman mixed and pressed into place when mammoths still walked parts of the earth. It took about 2 hours of patient effort before the heavy lid finally shifted. Then it came loose. Hawass leaned in and put his own head down over the gap to look inside. He later said he had expected the ordinary things that survived from that far back. Bones, maybe. A decayed wooden coffin. The dry leftovers of a body that had lain in the ground for more than 4,000 years. That is not what was waiting down there. Inside lay a man, wrapped from head to foot, and covered in gold. Not gold jewelry scattered around him. Gold on the body itself, laid over the wrappings in thin sheets of leaf, so the whole figure seemed to glow in the beam of the flashlight. I put my head inside, Hawass said afterward, describing a beautiful mummy of a man completely covered in layers of gold, and carved across the top of the sarcophagus was a name, spelled out in hieroglyphs. It read HQASPS. We say it as Hekashepes. For the first time in more than 4,000 years, someone was looking at him. Now, who was Hekashepes? The honest answer is that we know very little about the man himself. He left behind no long list of titles, no famous story, no monument with his life carved into it. But the way he was buried says plenty. You do not get a sealed, 45-ton limestone sarcophagus at the bottom of a 15-meter shaft, your body wrapped in gold, if you are an ordinary Egyptian. This was a man of real wealth and standing, even if he was not a king. And the gold was only the start of it. Look closer at the body, and the details get stranger. He wore a band around his head, a bracelet lay across his chest, and underneath the gold, it looks like he was fully dressed, in a tunic with a belt, almost as if he had been prepared not to lie in a tomb, but to stand up and walk out the door. One Egyptologist who studied the published photographs, Francesco Tiradriti, pointed out that the whole outfit reads like an attempt to hold on to the living look of the man, to preserve how he appeared while he was still alive and breathing. That is a very deliberate kind of burial. Somebody wanted this man to last forever, and wanted him to look like himself when he got there. There's a reason the Egyptians reached for gold in particular, and it wasn't only about showing off wealth. In their beliefs, the flesh of the gods was made of gold and their bones of silver. Gold did not rust, did not rot, did not fade. To wrap a body in it was to try to make that person imperishable, to push them across the line from human into something closer to a god. Every sheet of leaf on Hekashepes was a small prayer against time, and that raises a question worth sitting with. This kind of treatment, the gold, the sealed stone box, the careful dressing of the body, is what we expect for kings. Hekashepes was not a king. He was a wealthy official, one rung down from royalty. If a man at his level could be sent into the afterlife looking like a minor god, it tells us the reach of this craft was wider and started earlier than the famous royal burials would ever let on. The pharaohs get the museums and the movies. Men like Hekashepes got quietly gilded too, and then forgotten for 4,000 years. But here's the detail that turned a great find into an argument. When Hawa stood in front of the cameras, he said something huge. He said this might be the oldest and most complete mummy ever found in Egypt. And that is where the story splits in two. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything that followed. The word oldest is a loaded one in Egyptology, and the moment it left his mouth, other experts started pushing back hard. Here is the problem. There are older human remains from Egypt, and they are not a secret. At a site called Gebelein, far to the south near Luxor, there are natural mummies that go back more than 5,000 years, centuries before Hekashepes was even born. One of them, a man now kept in the British Museum and nicknamed by staff for his reddish hair, has become one of the most studied bodies from the ancient world. But he and the others like him were not wrapped and gilded by embalmers. They were dried out by the hot desert sand, all on their own, by accident, with no priests, no ritual, and no gold anywhere near them. So people thought they had the full picture when they read the headline. They were wrong. What made Hekashepes special was not simply his age in years. It was that he appears to be one of the oldest bodies preserved on purpose, by human hands, and then covered in gold, all at this early date. Faced with the pushback, Hawass sharpened his own claim. Speaking to the science press, he clarified that what he really meant was the oldest complete mummy covered with gold, not the oldest body from Egypt, the oldest gilded one. And somehow, that smaller, more careful claim is the more interesting one, because it points straight at a question that historians have been circling for a long time. How early did the Egyptians really master this craft? We tend to picture the golden burials of Egypt as a much later thing, the world of Tutankhamun, whose solid gold mask is one of the most recognized objects on the planet. But Tutankhamun lived more than 1,000 years after Hekashepes, more than 1,000 years. If a private official, not a pharaoh, not royalty, was being wrapped and gilded 4,300 years ago in the Old Kingdom, then the skill of dressing the dead in gold was already alive far earlier than the tourist poster version of Egypt suggests. The craft we associate with the Boy King may have deep roots we have barely started to trace. One museum write-up put it bluntly: a find like this could rewrite the history of mummification, not the whole story, and not overnight. But it drags a very sophisticated practice back deeper into the timeline than the neat, tidy version allows. The measurements and the photographs are sitting there, and they are still arguing with the textbook. Because artificial mummification was not simple, to preserve a body on purpose, Egyptian embalmers had to remove the soft insides that rot first, dry the whole body out for weeks using a natural salt called natron, and then wrap it and coat it in resins to seal it against decay. That is a chain of steps built on real knowledge of how a body breaks down and how to stop it. Every one of those steps had to be learned, refined, and passed on. To find a body given the full, high-end treatment this early is to find proof that Egyptian embalmers were already deep into their craft, generations before the golden ages we usually credit for it. And here is the thing. Hekashepes was not even the only prize in that dig, because while the golden mummy grabbed the world's headlines, the same excavation was pulling other tombs and other treasures out of the ground around Gisr el-Mudir. And a few of them may matter just as much to the people who study this age for a living. One tomb belonged to a man named Khnumjedef. He was a priest and an inspector of officials, and he served in the pyramid complex of a king named Unas, the last pharaoh of the 5th dynasty, who ruled around 2350 BC. That name matters more than it might seem. Unas is the king whose pyramid holds the earliest known pyramid texts, the oldest religious spells ever carved into a royal tomb, written on the walls to guide the dead king into the afterlife. Khnumjadef worked in the shadow of that pyramid, and his own tomb was painted with colorful scenes of everyday Egyptian life. That decoration might sound small, just paint on a wall. It wasn't. Those painted scenes are some of the clearest windows we have into how these people actually lived, worked, farmed, and celebrated more than 4,000 years ago. Another tomb belonged to a man named Mary, who carried one of the most intriguing titles in the entire ancient court. He was a keeper of the secrets. That was a genuine office, held by a senior palace official, and it granted him the authority to perform special religious rituals that ordinary Egyptians were never allowed to witness. Imagine holding a job whose actual title, carved into your tomb for eternity, was Keeper of the Secrets. A third tomb was linked to a priest who served in the pyramid complex of Pepi I, a king of the dynasty that followed. But the statues might be the quiet headline of the whole dig. In one shaft, this one about 10 meters deep, the team found a stack of beautiful wooden statues, 14 of them in all, carved to look like men, women, servants, and whole families. These figures date to the Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramids, and some experts think they may be even older than Hekashepes himself. That detail alone is remarkable. Wooden objects almost never survive 4,000 years anywhere on Earth. They rot, they burn, they crumble. But in the bone-dry air deep under Saqqara, these carvings held on, their faces still readable after all that time. There were carved stone statues too. 9 of them belonged to a man named Messi, found near a false door. A false door is one of the stranger ideas the Egyptians left us. It's a carved stone doorway built into a tomb wall that leads nowhere at all, solid rock behind it. But they believed the spirit of the dead could pass through it, stepping between the world of the living and the world beyond, to collect the food and offerings left for it. In their minds, it was the busiest doorway in the tomb, even though no living body could ever walk through it. There was a set of statues of a judge and writer named Fetek, found beside an offering table, with his own stone sarcophagus and mummy resting nearby. There was a triad, a group of 3 figures carved together from a single block. Hawass called it the largest group of statues like this found at Saqqara in 100 years. And no, that is not a small thing to claim about a site that has been dug and redug for well over a century. Around all of this lay the smaller pieces that quietly fill in the picture. Amulets meant to protect the dead on their journey, stone vessels, everyday tools, the kind an ordinary worker would have used. Statues of Ptah Sokar, a god tied to this very ground, since the name Saqqara itself is believed to come from Sokar, an old god of this necropolis. Every one of those small objects is another thread connecting us directly to the people who lived and died here. And there was one more tomb from this stretch of ground that deserves its own moment because of what was hidden inside it. Working the same Gisr el-Mudir area, Hawass's team had also opened the tomb of a man named Kar. Kar was a physician, an ancient Egyptian doctor. His tomb was small, but beautifully decorated. And inside, they found a set of surgical tools, the actual metal instruments of a healer who practiced medicine more than 4,000 years ago. Hold that image for a second. The real tools, from the hands of a real doctor, from an age we usually imagine as pure myth. Just outside that tomb sat around 30 statues from a much later period, and one of them stood apart from all the rest. It was a figure of Imhotep. If that name rings a bell, it should. Imhotep was the architect credited with designing the step pyramid itself, the very monument that towers over this whole cemetery. He was a real man who became a legend. Over the centuries, Egyptians remembered him first as a genius builder, then honored him as a great healer, and finally worshipped him almost as a god of medicine. To find his image standing guard outside the tomb of a physician, just a short walk from the pyramid he is said to have built, is the kind of connection that makes the whole necropolis feel less like a graveyard and more like a living story. So step back and look at what one season of digging pulled out of the sand. A sealed golden mummy that reopened a real argument about the timeline of mummification. Tombs of priests and officials painted with the daily life of a lost world. The largest hall of statues from Saqqara in a century. Surgical tools from a 4,000-year-old doctor. A statue of the man who may have invented monumental stone building, standing watch over it all. And every single piece of it found in the shadow of a giant enclosure whose purpose we still cannot explain. Now here is what should keep you up at night. This is not the end of the dig. It is barely the middle of it. When Hawass announced the golden mummy, He also mentioned a second sarcophagus, nearly identical to the first, that had not yet been opened. It was sitting in another sealed shaft nearby, waiting its turn, still closed after 4,300 years. Nobody in the modern world knew what was inside. He talked too about a buried wall his team had found running underground, on and on, that they had not yet reached the end of. They could not say what it was for, how old it was, or where it led. It was simply there, in the dark, waiting like everything else. And that is just what one team, in one small corner, has managed to reach so far. Look at an aerial photograph of Saqqara, and you can pick out the faint shapes of other buried enclosures, still sleeping under the sand. Rectangles and outlines the desert has almost completely swallowed. The vast majority of this necropolis has never been touched by a shovel. Egypt's own Antiquities officials have said, more than once, that they believe only a fraction of what lies beneath Saqqara has actually been found. For 4,300 years, Hekashepes lay in the dark, sealed, gilded, and waiting. A few hundred meters from a rectangle no one can explain, under a desert, everyone thought had already given up its secrets. It took until 2023 for anyone to lift his lid. And when they finally did, he cracked open something far bigger than one man's tomb. So the real question isn't who Hekashepes was. It's how many more sealed doors are still down there in the dark, under the sand at Saqqara, that no living person has ever opened. We want to know what you think is waiting inside that second sarcophagus, the one they still haven't opened. Tell us in the comments. We read every one. And if you want to see what else is hiding beneath the sand at a site the history books skip right past, the next one is already waiting for you on screen.